In this video, I'd like to continue our discussion of Shelley's poem Ode to the West Wind by looking at Sonnet 3, which is the middle of the poem. In this particular sonnet, Shelley talks about the Mediterranean, which is very peaceful, very lovely, and then he turns to the Atlantic, which is much more dramatic in its action. So this continues the poem's focus on binaries or contrasts, which in this case is the difference between the peaceful Mediterranean and, as I mentioned before, the dramatic Atlantic. So let's start with the first part then. He says, "Thou who didst waken from his summer dreams the blue Mediterranean." And the verb waken here, didst waken, is in the past tense, which is interesting because later the Atlantic's action is in the present tense, which creates a nice effect. We move towards the present, we move towards drama, but also this reminds us that Shelley is trying to capture many different moments when the west wind does something, and this is in contrast, I would say, to the typical romantic poem. Many of these romantic lyrics are trying to capture a single intense moment of feeling. So Shelley is in a sense saying, hey, my poem is trying to do something sublime here by focusing on many different moments which are almost impossible to capture together, to bring together, and to describe poetically. He continues then talking about the blue Mediterranean, and he says, "Thou who didst waken from his summer dreams, the blue Mediterranean, where he lay, lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams." Crystalline means very clear, like crystal. Coil is a little bit like a rope, right? If you think of a rope which is kind of wound up or curled up in a circle, and you can easily imagine that the streams of the water often end in these kind of patterns as well. So he's saying the streams are almost like a snake, right, with a kind of coil pattern, and these streams themselves are hypnotized or sung to sleep, lulled to sleep by, in a sense, the Mediterranean itself. We might expect the wind to be doing this, but it says lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams. So it's actually the Mediterranean that sings itself to sleep. And this often reminds me of the Disney film, The Jungle Book. Maybe you remember the snake. Kaa is his name. And Kaa tries to hypnotize Mowgli, the main character, and he sings songs like, trust in me, trust in me. And the funny thing is, at the end, he hypnotizes himself and falls out of a tree. So it's a funny moment. And maybe that helps to explain a little bit what the Mediterranean is doing here, that its streams are so hypnotizing that it kind of lulls itself to sleep. But the west wind is going to wake it up at some point. Then the second set of 3 lines here continues, beside a pumice isle in Bias Bay. Now, an isle is just an island, and pumice is a volcanic rock that's very light and very porous. So it's kind of this dreamlike description here. And as a result, then, we have this island beside which the Mediterranean flows. In Bias Bay, this is close to Naples, so on the west coast of Italy. And Bias Bay is a place where there used to be a party town way back in Roman times, but then because of volcanic activity, the water rose, and now the whole town, whatever's left of it, is underwater. And you can go scuba diving if you want and see the statues, which are covered with algae and things like that. So he says then, beside a pumice isle in Bias Bay, and saw in sleep old palaces and towers quivering within the waves in tenser day. Such a beautiful description. It's like the Mediterranean is dreaming about what you can see in the Mediterranean, which in this case are these old palaces and towers quivering, right? Because if you're looking through the waves, then you can't see these things entirely clearly. They are quivering within the waves in tenser day. So, in other words, as the light streams through the water, it's as if the light becomes more intense, and there's this beautiful clarity to the water. Isn't that just a lovely description? And I think you can also take this phrase, the waves intenser day, as maybe an allusion to poetry as well, because poetry also makes us more aware of the intensity of things, of the beauty of things. As it turns out, the critic Harold Bloom has talked about these lines, and he feels that there are other ways to read them as well, or at least additional things to say about them. So for instance, he points out that the palaces and towers refer to previous despotic powers. In other words, there have been previous political organizations, perhaps some of them included tyrants and dictators and so on. And given that the poem becomes very political towards the end, maybe this is also an interesting reference to think about. Towards the end of this particular sonnet, it's interesting too that Shelley writes that the ocean knows the voice of the west wind and grows gray with fear. So we could also say that there's a sense of the west wind as a tyrant towards the end, making its subjects tremble and showing itself to be a master. I would say that this ambivalence between admiring tyranny and criticizing it is something you see elsewhere in Shelley's poetry too, the poem Ozymandias being a very good example. Although this notion that you should be strong like the tyrant has more to do with individuality, right? Kind of a Nietzschean perspective, I would say. All right, we don't have tons of time to get into that, but let's continue here. So he's talking then about how these palaces and towers under the water are beautiful. And you could, of course, read the poem in other ways too. You could also talk about towers and palaces on the land being reflected in the water. I don't think that's the primary meaning here, but it's another way to think about this image. I mentioned the waves intenser day, and here Harold Bloom has something to say as well. So he says that this represents how over time people tend to idealize the past. They romanticize the past. So he talks about the idealizing that can come with time. Maybe that's reading a little bit too much into these lines, but it's an interesting reflection nevertheless. Shelley continues by saying that this depiction is overgrown with azure moss. So azure is blue, and we had a blue reference before, one of Shelley's favorite colors. Azure moss and flowers, right? Because the moss, there's not really moss on these statues under the water, but we can sort of imagine them like being on land. So sweet, the sense faints picturing them. In this case, the sublime is so sweet that we can almost not make sense of it. We're overcome by it, and it's making us faint. Now, I don't think that Shelley feels that the sublime is ever really just sweetness. In his poem Ode to the Skylark, for instance, he writes, "Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught." And I think that's common for Shelley, the sense that the sublime is really more about contrast. So you can't just stop with the Mediterranean and faint with sweetness. You have to have other aspects of this as well, right? The fear and the terror and all of these other things. So let's go on to the last bit then. And now we turn our attention to the Atlantic Ocean, further away. It says, "Thou," that's the west wind, "for whose path the Atlantic's level powers," so we can think of the Atlantic being flat or level, "cleave themselves into chasms." A chasm is a crevice in the rocks, and in this case you can imagine that the level powers suddenly turn into these waves, right? So this is a chasm, and typical of Shelley, he uses imagery from a different context, just like we had the moss before, and then applies it to something new to really create this interaction between different descriptions. There's a nice emphasis on the k sound as well, somewhat like onomatopoeia, right? It makes it sound like it. Cleave themselves into chasms. So we have some nice repetition here. And he goes on to say, "While far below the sea blooms and the oozy woods which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean know thy voice, and suddenly grow grey with fear, and tremble and despoil themselves." In a note which Shelley had added to the poem, he talked about what he called this phenomenon where the foliage under the water, so algae and things like that, starts to sympathize, as he calls it, with the vegetation on land. And he says this is something that's known to scientists, and he's trying to capture this in his poem. So if the vegetation on land, the leaves are falling down and things like that, is described in one way, then this sapless foliage of the ocean, right, the algae, it also starts to imitate whatever is happening on land. And as a result, it grows gray with fear. It loses its green color, or other colors, brown and so on, and it suddenly grows gray when the storm comes, when the wind starts to blow, and the ocean turns itself into huge waves. So that's basically the idea here. And the important thing to realize is that Shelley is talking here about sympathy between two different things. So this concept of sympathy is very important. It really nicely ties also to the romantic emphasis on the creative imagination, right? That you feel sympathy for others, that you naturally kind of put yourself into somebody else's shoes, and that this allows you then to have this beautiful imaginative experience. So that's one way in which we can think about this. Another way in which we should think about sympathy is that in stanza 4 and 5, Shelley's going to talk about how he relates to the west wind. And he talks, for instance, about how he sees himself as a lyre, as a harp on which the wind is playing. He compares himself to the forest through which the wind blows and rustles the leaves. And so he says, I need to somehow make myself passive in order to receive the effect of the wind. What we are talking about here then is a kind of willing passivity. Maybe that's a good way to describe it. A willing passivity, right? You can't just be passive naturally. You have to almost will it. I'm going to open myself up for inspiration. And in the same way, the Atlantic's level powers cleave themselves into chasms, right? They do this to themselves. Remember also that image before of the Mediterranean working on itself. But before, the effect was one of hypnotism and falling asleep. But now, the emphasis is on action. So in this case, Shelley says you can't just have one. You can't just kind of focus on yourself, but you have to allow yourself to be affected by the west wind, by natural forces. This last verb, by the way, despoil themselves. Actually, the last verb is here, but despoil is what we're focusing on. Despoil here means like pillage or plunder. So in this case, it's like the west wind pillages itself and takes away its own color. All right, so I hope that helps a little bit with this sonnet, and in the next video, we'll turn to Sonnet 4.